Montgomery bus boycott, women who protested and marched and stood up to armed police and went to jail. What if I told you that a civil rights movement group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was most likely the most egalitarian organization in the United States in the 1960s, both in terms of race and in terms of gender? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was founded by a woman. It was staffed by women, and women were so well trained in activism that many of them went on to leadership roles in the women's movement after their time in SNCC. What if I also told you that those women who had worked for racial justice together, hand in hand, black and white together, went on to the women's movement separately, segregated by race, sometimes not even on speaking terms with each other? What if I told you that it was a secret feminist manifesto that drove them apart? Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into one specific intersection of the civil rights movement and the feminist movement that happened within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating.
The feminist movement was purposely placed in the middle of civil rights. Okay, then an intersection in feminism and the bonding of civil rights was done by Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt. Pauli Murray told you why she did it. Why she did it. Her and Eleanor Roosevelt actually did it because they thought that a freer society would help everybody. So far as the rising tide lifts all boats. If you free everybody, then everybody is equal, or everybody gets what they need, right? Okay? Didn't turn out to be that way. Because guess what happens after the women got what they wanted? Guess what they did? They cast everybody else aside.
Yep.
Yeah. They took the lion's share for themselves.
Committee. This is a fascinating, powerful, heartbreaking story, and one that's near and dear to my heart because I wrote my master's thesis at Stanford on it. It's also so important because it depicts a mistake that has happened over and over again in the feminist movement. See if you can pick out what that is. Okay, first, let's learn a little bit more about SNCC, or SNCC. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was started by a 57-year-old Black woman named Ella Baker, who had decades of experience doing sit-ins and freedom rides and organizing with the NAACP. She worked with Dr. Martin Luther King at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but she had a really hard time with the patriarchal hierarchy of that.
Same thing that Pauli Murray had in the 40s, in the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, and what broke it was really broke her was the March on Washington in '63, Martin Luther King, where the black women were not included on stage. That's what pissed her off, and that's why sex went into that bill.
Organization. King and his friends had been trained in the Baptist tradition of male headship, and Baker said that the minister's ego ran the show. She was a brilliant, mature woman with tons of experience, but she was being asked to make copies and fetch coffee, and her voice was frequently overrun at the SCLC. Then, in 1960, college students started lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they ignited a protest movement across the South. Ella Baker recognized their...
Actually, the college sit-ins, according to Murray, started in the, I do believe in the 30s, okay, in the 40s, coming out of Howard, and started in D.C. and other places around it. So the sit-ins were actually older than the 60s.
Potential to electrify the civil rights movement with youthful energy. And so when Dr. King suggested that the students fall under his leadership at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Baker disagreed. She gathered the students and encouraged them to form their own group and do things their own way. After debating the pros and cons, the students took Baker's advice and named themselves the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC activists like John Lewis, Diane Nash, Bob Moses, Stokely Carmichael, and later Fannie Lou Hamer were behind the scenes and on the front lines of most civil rights initiatives that you've heard about. And although SNCC was always a Black-led, Black-majority organization, it also had a large number of white staff from the very beginning. Ella Baker's two first hires were white women, and their logo explicitly promoted interracial harmony.
See? Look at that. See? And it was mostly white women.
They often held hands across each other's bodies, singing the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome."
We'll walk hand in hand.
But all the white women.
We'll walk hand in hand.
In order to understand what happened between Black and white women in SNCC, we need to look at what these students were carrying inside them when they met each other. We all carry our experiences inside of us, and sometimes we don't realize how much our histories affect us. These two figures, for example, are holding hands at the same time in the same place. They're both at the March on Washington in 1963, and both of them are women. But inside the mind and heart of each of these women is a whole history of inherited narratives from their families and personal experiences that shapes the way they see the world. Ella Baker's own grandmother had been enslaved. In 1960, they were not even 100 years removed from the Emancipation Proclamation, and Baker talked about her grandmother often. Another feature of many Black women's lives was that most of their mothers and grandmothers had worked hard, both inside and outside the home. The cult of domesticity, where men made enough money to support a family and women were confined to the home, was not the reality for most Black families. Another of the most significant influences that many Black women talked about was the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Emmett Till was 14 years old when he was brutally lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Till's mother had photos of her son's body published in Jet magazine, and several SNCC women wrote that they remembered their parents trying to hide those images from them when they were little. Many SNCC workers were exactly Till's age when he was killed, and SNCC worker Dory Ladner wrote, "Ours was the Emmett Till generation. No other single incident had a more profound impact on so many people who came into SNCC. He could have been one of our brothers." At the same time, many white women were growing up in what some people called a different America. One of the issues that impacted many white women entering civil rights work was a growing awareness of women's subordination. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex had just been published in America in 1953, and many of the white women who would go on to work in SNCC had read Beauvoir during college. As white women realized their second-class status in society, they became aware that they were relegated to all of the housework and care work at home, and when white women did work outside of the home, they were often confined to secretarial work. Women who were educated and qualified for leadership
sounds a lot like Ella Baker, right? That's how come she took to it.
Were often limited to jobs supporting male executives, and they were starting to become very sensitive to gender stereotype tasks such as typing, taking minutes of meetings, and making copies. So with these different background experiences, women entered SNCC. By all accounts, these women loved each other deeply. They worked together doing different tasks, eating together, working together, sleeping on floors together, risking their lives together. SNCC members, including women, literally faced down the KKK. They were beaten on the bridge in Selma with Dr. King. They changed the world together. And they
didn't be no white women on the bridge.
thought of each other like family. But then came Freedom Summer of 1964. In the early 1960s, violence in the South was intensifying. Activists were being beaten and killed, and the federal government continued its reluctance to intervene. Most of the nation was largely unaware of the voter suppression and of the terrorism unfolding in the South. So, SNCC and other civil rights organizations decided to drive attention to the situation by bringing college students, mostly Northern, mostly white college students, to Mississippi. They hoped that the presence of young white Americans would bring publicity that would put pressure on the government. So, in the summer of 1964, nearly 1,000 volunteers came down to the South, many of them white kids from elite colleges. There were several events that occurred during Freedom Summer that changed the racial dynamic broadly within SNCC and specifically for the women. First, in the very first week of Freedom Summer training in June 1964, 2 white men from New York and 1 black man from Mississippi were kidnapped by white supremacists. This event was depicted in the 1988 movie Mississippi Burning. While thousands of black men had disappeared and been lynched with no media attention or government intervention, in this case, where 2 white boys from New York were among the victims, the case generated national outrage and involvement of the FBI, which led to their bodies being found in August. Rita Schwerner, the widow of Mickey Schwerner, who was one of the victims, commented that if James Chaney, who was black, had gone missing by himself, his disappearance would have gone unnoticed. And she was right. Within SNCC, the reality set in that America really did value the lives of the white volunteers more than black lives. This created a terribly difficult ambivalence toward the white volunteers. Ella Baker famously said, "Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens." Another huge racial tension caused by Freedom Summer was the occurrence of interracial dating. The thing that would make white supremacists the most rabidly angry
here we go.
was the idea of what they called race mixing. This ideology also had roots in patriarchy. White men didn't consider race mixing as much of a problem if it was a white man with a black woman. White men had claimed sexual ownership of black women.
Yeah, it had been that way for a very long time.
Since the days of enslavement. But a black man could not be tolerated defiling a white man's woman, a woman he owned. And according to the thinking at the time, white women were pure and innocent and childlike and needed protection from black men, whom white men saw.
White women propagated that myth too, so it wasn't just white men doing it.
As predators. For this reason, many SNCC leaders prohibited black men and white women from even being seen together in order to keep black men
It's
They
safe. Yep.
lynched
And that was the original reason why black men were not allowed to be around white women for that very reason.
Lynchings were a very real, constant threat, especially in rural Mississippi, where SNCC did much of its work. This meant that white women who showed up in SNCC and wanted to help were placed away from black men. They were
But you
often
notice the white woman says that white men and black women were never a problem.
Nope.
Okay.
Daughters
So
of the trade, anybody?
daughters of trade. So the divesting goes way, way, way back. Okay. So so divesting is not new.
assigned to work indoors, behind the scenes, often in offices and schools. For women who joined SNCC as new volunteers during Freedom Summer, this could look on the outside like sexism. Knowing what we know about some of these white women's sensitivities about being kept inside, doing typing and office work, we can predict how they might feel about it. Now, it's important to point out that Black SNCC women worked as typists too, but they also worked outside in public doing everything Black men did, including holding leadership positions, because the presence of Black women didn't endanger Black men.
Exactly.
You can imagine that if Black men and white women weren't supposed to even be seen in public together, they really couldn't have visible romantic relationships.
That is true.
SNCC leader Charles Sherrod was very strict about prohibiting.
Yeah.
Now, I can confirm what she mentioned about Dr. King and that particular set of Baptist preachers. They are very patriarchal. Yes.
Yeah.
The Gaddafi, don't get it twisted. Gaddafi was still in there, but my pastor that baptized me very patriarchal.
Yeah, patriarchal leaning. Yeah.
Yeah,
leaning. In leaning. Yeah. Even though when they went home, there was a different reality. But that's very common even in the matriarchy. Okay, where your leadership will be male.
Yeah,
Because
he was not on women preaching at all.
no, most of the women are, because my mother is still against that, and she's in her 80s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I used to hear my mother say, well, basically, women ain't got no business in the pulpit.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
my sister disagrees, but
Yeah, your sister does, but I'm saying my mother. Unless your sister is 80 years old.
no, but she is 70.
Yeah, so she's a boomer.
Prohibiting interracial dating, calling the rules the anti-lynch code. But many of these relationships happened, and there are many ways of seeing this. On one hand, it's understandable. They were 20 years old. They were working and living together and risking their lives for each other, and they were flooded with hormones of 20-year-olds and didn't have fully developed adult brains yet to help them override those feelings. Also, many young people saw these relationships as the ultimate act of rebelling against segregation, which totally makes sense. On the other hand, white women's presence really did endanger Black men. At the same time, Black men were frequently scorned by their peers if they admitted to dating a white woman. They called it backsliding. So sometimes Black men and white women would have a consensual relationship in private, but then the man wouldn't acknowledge her in public. This understandably caused a lot of hurt feelings for the woman, and it looked and felt sexist for a man to sleep with a woman and then not even acknowledge her the next day in front of his friends. In fact, one white woman named Elaine DeLotte experienced this exact situation, and it hurt her deeply and made her really angry. Keep her in mind, because she's going to come up again in a minute when we talk about that feminist manifesto. So, in the summer of 1964, there were 4 white women living in Literacy House together. They were Casey Hayden, who grew up in the South and had defied segregation her whole life. Hayden had been with SNCC almost since the very beginning, and she was very close friends with Ella Baker and John Lewis. Mary King. Mary King graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University with a degree in English and apparently showed up to SNCC and said, "How can I help?" She was really good at writing press releases, which publicized SNCC's work, kept people safe, and helped recruit donors. Emmy Schrader. Emmy Schrader had attended Radcliffe College, which was the sister college of Harvard.
Elite white women.
She worked in liberation movements in Algeria and Kenya, where she observed what she thought to be extremely sexist traditions there. And she came home from Africa as a self-described radical feminist. And fourth, Elaine DeLotte. DeLotte also attended Radcliffe, Harvard, where she had horrifyingly sexist experiences with men that radicalized her as a feminist. Also, DeLotte was Jewish and had spent time on a kibbutz in Israel prior to joining SNCC, where she observed men and women working side by side as equals. These 4 roommates had all read Simone de Beauvoir during college, and Literacy House became a hotbed of discussion, with many other women, mostly white, but also some Black women and even some Black men, becoming interested in the discussions about women's issues. They said they passed the second sex around SNCC until the cover fell off. As a result of this feminist consciousness, Mary King started gathering evidence of sexist incidents happening around SNCC and writing them down. In her memoir, she said it wasn't hard to find them. They were everywhere. So now we arrive in November of 1964, when the leader of SNCC, James Foreman, called for a conference in Waveland, Mississippi. Many different currents were converging at this conference, and one current is that these 4 white women had started developing a robust awareness of women's issues. But panning out to the bigger picture, SNCC had been traumatized by violence, including constant jailings and beatings and the fear of lynching. The fabric of black and white together was beginning to fray. So SNCC leader James Foreman called this retreat to try to heal wounds and determine a way forward. Foreman had solicited position papers from its members. Any staff member could write their position or opinion on any topic they chose to be discussed at the conference. So, late at night, the night before the conference started, Casey Hayden, Mary King, Elaine DeLotte, and Emmy Schrader crept into a small room and they huddled around a typewriter, and in hushed voices they composed a secret manifesto about the position of women in SNCC. They decided not to sign their names, saying they were too nervous about how the paper would be received. They then dropped it in a basket along with 40 other position papers and snuck back to bed. The following day, all of the papers were read out loud, including the anonymous position paper. Here are some highlights from their paper. Although there are some women in a Mississippi project who have been working as long as some of the men, the leadership group is all men. A veteran of 2 years' work for SNCC in 2 states spends her day typing and doing clerical work for other people in her project. Capable, responsible, and experienced women who are in leadership positions can expect to have to defer to a man on their project for final decision-making. The average white person finds it difficult to understand why the Negro resents being called boy or being thought of as musical and athletic, because the average white person doesn't realize that he assumes he is superior. So too, the average SNCC worker finds it difficult to discuss the woman problem because of the assumption of male superiority. Assumptions of male superiority are as widespread and deep-rooted and every bit
familiar.
as crippling to the woman
doesn't
as
it?
the assumptions
Doesn't it? What do you hear of modern day intersectional feminists?
What was that you said? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
It does rhyme, yeah. These are the seeds of it, right? Okay. This was fed to black women. That's why I showed you. What's her name?
Giovanni.
No, not Giovanni. That's why I showed you. Well, I showed you Giovanni, but also what's her name? Okay.
Polly Murray.
No, the womanist, and what she was saying. See, in other words, this is where the split happened. Okay, because white women thought that, because of their experience, they thought that black women experienced the same thing from their men that they experienced from white men. It's not the same. Okay, that also happened in the 1850s with the suffragettes. They're assuming that that your black man is not as good as a white man, and basically if you elevate him to the role of a white man, he's going to be just as bad as the white man.
white supremacy are to the Negro. The authors were anonymous, so everybody wondered who had written it. And at some point, we don't know when or how, people figured out that the paper had been written by a group of white women. We have conflicting accounts of how everybody responded to the paper. Mary King said that the four women endured crushing criticism, while Casey Hayden said it caused hardly a ripple. The only response to the Waveland paper that was recorded at the time was a joke that was made by Stokely Carmichael. After an exhausting day, the conference participants met on a dock in the moonlight with glasses of wine to sing and talk with their heads on each other's laps, as Casey Hayden recalled. Carmichael, in typical stand-up comedian fashion, stood up to deliver a wisecrack. "What is the position of women in SNCC?" he asked. "The only position for women in SNCC is prone." Again, we have conflicting reports about how people took the joke. Mary King represented most people's recollections, saying that they all collapsed with hilarity. Elaine DeLotte, on the other hand, said, "I am dead certain that I did not laugh." Whatever women's reactions were at the time, this joke lived on in infamy, as you can see if you Google Stokely Carmichael. After the Waveland Conference was over, SNCC started shifting to embrace a philosophy of Black power. In fact, the phrase Black power actually came from Stokely Carmichael. And in 1966, Black SNCC members voted to expel its remaining white staff, telling them to fight their own oppressors. Many Black SNCC members did not speak to white people again for years. To be clear, the women's position paper was not the only cause of the racial divide within SNCC. All the factors that we talked about earlier had fractured this family beyond repair. But we do know that the authors of the position paper thought the Black women would be on board with them, and they were surprised that they were not. While we don't have any records from the time that it happened, I was able to interview SNCC worker Judy Richardson about this incident. She said, quote, When I read the paper, I remember not understanding why folks were talking about sexism, when what I felt was overwhelmingly more important was racism against Black folks, male and female. This discussion seemed a diversion from the issue that was definitely more critical, namely racism, and the fact that white supremacists wanted us dead. This assessment is representative of every single Black woman I read who wrote about it after the fact. And here's something we haven't talked about yet. Even though Black women were defensive of Black men, it's not like they just turned a blind eye to their sexism. Black SNCC worker Gwendolyn Robinson started a task force to eliminate sexual harassment and assault within SNCC. Black SNCC women initiated a sit-in in SNCC's headquarters to protest secretarial work. SNCC's executive secretary, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, was universally respected and kind of feared. She was reported to whack guys right in the face if they said sexist stuff. And a few years later, SNCC worker Frances Beale wrote a groundbreaking pamphlet called Double Jeopardy: To Be Black and Female, which became a classic work of
intersectional feminism. Yeah, classic work.
In other words, I'm independent is not new, huh?
No, it's not new.
Critique. This title, To Be Black and Female, is essential to understand.
Going all the way back to Pauli Murray and Jane Crow in 1947.
It seems to me that when the white authors published those feminist papers which criticized Black men, they were in a way asking Black women to choose sides and pick a part of their identity. They could choose woman and align themselves with white women, or Black and align themselves with Black men, who were their literal brothers and fathers and sons, who were in an existential battle for their lives and their civil rights. Later, the Black women's movement would develop the term womanism, which is an alternative to feminism. Alice Walker, who you might remember as the author of The Color Purple, coined this term in 1980, writing a description that speaks directly to the conflict in SNCC. She wrote, "Many Black women view feminism as a movement."
Alice Walker, from the bottom of my heart, fuck you, bitch.
Yeah, well, she went the other way. Yeah, she went to the dark side.
Dedicated to attacking or eliminating.
Why? Oh,
Mr.
Color
has
Purple?
yeah. Mr. has my name.
You know what? That's Black women have carried that low boiling contempt and hatred of Black men forever. It hasn't changed. Okay.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed. Rapists, abusers, beaters, all kind of stuff, right? Never changed.
And one thing I've always said about that movie is when she was reading that letter, and he slapped the shit out of her, and then asked Mister, and then asked him to ask Celia to go shave him.
Oh, shave him. Oh yeah. That's
even when I was younger, I was like, there's no way I could. There's no Black chick I grew up with I could go to and do that without getting cut.
Without getting cut, yeah, you wouldn't do that and ask her to shave you, okay? And then want to see your next birthday. It's not gonna happen. Yeah,
that just wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
I don't care how weak you thought they were.
Oh no, you sure wouldn't unless she got off on it.
Womanism supplies a way for Black women to address gender oppression without attacking Black men. The fact is that there remains a schism within feminism. This divide started before the 1960s. Perhaps it started when Africans were first brought to America in chains, and European women participated in enslaving them. It was certainly exacerbated by episodes in our history that I don't have time to enumerate here. Tragically, and I do see this story as a tragedy, the efforts of even these courageous and loving white women failed to heal the breach. I argue in my thesis that one act that might have made a big difference would have been for those 4 authors to invite their Black colleagues to write the papers with them. Judy Richardson, for example, may have offered critical insights on content or tone or on the wisdom of the timing that might have sent history on a different course, but that's not what happened. And as time passed, something happened that added insult to injury. In 1979, 15 years after the Waveland paper, Casey Hayden got a letter from white historian Sarah Evans, who was writing about the foundations of the women's liberation movement, and she wanted to know more about women in SNCC and some legendary women's manifesto. Evans wrote a book about SNCC called Personal Politics: The Roots of Women's Liberation in the Civil Rights Movement.
It was never supposed to be in the civil rights movements in the first place.
The Waveland position paper and Sex and Caste, along with Stokely Carmichael's joke, and painted SNCC as a snake pit of misogyny. That book became the defining historical record about SNCC, so much so that when I was first investigating this topic during my master's degree, this was still the text that was recommended to me as the first thing to read, but it wasn't accurate. Sarah Evans' depiction of Black SNCC men as misogynists made Black SNCC women even more defensive of their brothers and even more distrustful of white women. It was at this point that Black women began to publish their own accounts of their time in SNCC. I read an email exchange between several Black SNCC women who talked about how furious they were about their brothers being cast as sexist monsters with their muddy Delta boots on the necks of white women. And then they said,
with their
if we don't write our own
muddy Delta boots on the necks of white women. Jesus Christ.
stories, they will be written for us. They published their accounts in these two books, Hands on the Freedom Plow and Many Minds, One Heart. And I recommend them wholeheartedly to anyone who's interested in the civil rights movement or on the relationship between Black and white women. Which brings me back to my initial question about the intersections of the movements for racial and gender justice. Did you identify the missteps? For me, I think one of the most important things I've learned is that white Western women have historically imposed their own lenses, assuming that sexism is the most acute pain point for all women, when often it's not. Let's make sure we are listening and that we never ever speak for another group of women. I personally am dedicated to healing this rift however I can, moving forward together. Tell me your thoughts in the comments.
No, they want Black women back on their side. Okay.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I know the perfect way to heal this shit.
Okay.
Start a passport fund. That's what you gonna do.
Oh, well, that has united them. That's for sure. In fact, I think the non-black men have basically taken over the hashtag, and they're becoming the face of it.
Yeah, we're raggedy bastards, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah.
What else is new?